the unreasonable man to continue, don't we? Because we don't want a kind of hopefully deep and possibly even profound knowledge of history and what's happened before to merely result in a kind of gentlemanly outcome. We don't really want that. We want it to result in a vigorous and desirous outcome. You know, so the issue of colour, you go back, you hardly have to go back at all to find that colour was just a major part of architecture. And if they want to go back to the white temples, the same then. We all know the 19th century said, oops, you know, they used to be all red and green and blue and yellow, and you know, their eyes were blue and all of that amazing
So you
stuff,
would reject the gentleman architect?
We all know looks horrible compared to the white.
Well, horrifying.
We like the gentleman
and paganistic,
scholar.
all the things that
you would never discount the scholar, but it is to do with the application of propositions and research. So you know, the fine study and unbelievably deep understanding of Australian architecture by the gentleman Conrad Hayman, you would say that's a very honourable. But when it comes to the practice of it, it has to arc up a bit. Otherwise, you know, well, I guess I don't know why it's an otherwise. It's just more interesting that way.
So then, is the outrage then coming from ignorance rather than you know, ideology, or is it ideology born of ignorance?
I think it's coming from a sudden and disconcerting understanding that their own belief system's based on nothing much.
So that's about preference. That's just preference more than anything else. No. I have a preference for white rather than colour.
Like for instance, you know, if the Sydney school, a group of Sydney architects who are absolutely committed to the minimal act and reductionism, if you challenge that, really relatively easily challengeable, it just undermines their whole belief system that the eye can judge it, that the mere act of reduction is an act of authenticity and timelessness. You know,
and I guess perhaps it means that it's founded on, perhaps it's sometimes slightly superficial, but it's founded on, it's based on the idea that we know that to do architecture you have to know the right thing to do. And the right thing to do maybe is a whole lineage of classicism that perhaps ends up in a minimalism, perhaps as a certain one alignment. Whereas the proposition that we don't know, which is where we fall in, we'd say we don't really know, so we're just having a go.
That's
not
the
to
other
say
name.
that
That's
not
the
that
other
it
name
isn't,
for the
not
exhibition.
that it isn't based
we don't
on,
really know,
you
so we're having a go.
Some kind of background, but it isn't a background that ends up knowing. It's a background that ends up with the necessity to experiment and explore. So it's a different response to some kind of background, and it isn't, and therefore it doesn't go down the path of a continuous refinement or evolution of something to the present, and therefore we should all be at the same place. It doesn't believe that model. It believes that things are probably expansive and more problematic as we go forward, and more different.
So is that about the sort of acquiring of knowledge rather than the presentation of knowledge, you know, sort of or demonstration of knowledge, that is the refinement of a particular idea? Yeah,
in terms like exegetical or something, which is, you know, a great tradition of, say, scriptural and literary theory. It never has the outcome of, well, now we finally know. I mean, that's not what exegesis is trying to do. It's constantly exploring, what do we know now? How does this relate to now? Now keeps changing, you know, so that the explanation, we have to constantly go back to the material and say, well, what does it mean now? Because it can't mean the same as it meant then. It must mean something else.
Well, that guy who does the history of science on SBS, which was on last night, he was talking about post the discovery of DNA, how the guys who, Crick and Wilson, and somebody who actually sponsored that, came out of the Manhattan Project,
Oh, right.
and the reductionist idea down to this must be the building block, and all the research that did post the discovery of that, actually the great revelation was that things don't get simpler. They actually get more complicated. So in fact, he had I can't remember the phrase, but essentially about the essence of life is not down and down into simplicity, it's actually up and up into complexity. So the more that they've researched DNA, they've found it's actually more complicated.
So every question they answer, they've got 10 new ones.
Yeah.
Well then, from that, can we talk a little bit about the one-liner?
Theoretical physics.
And
Well, they thought they were getting to the atom,
yeah,
and they just got to a completely mad new universe that was inside it.
inside the atom.
And there may well be more inside those. You know, lots of people think there are now.
Well, I think on that, can we talk a little bit about the one-liner? And that there has been some criticism, actually from Melbourne University graduates, about ARM as being a firm of one-liners.
Oh, has it?
Yeah, there was something in the paper a little while ago. And I thought, you know, like it's interesting that you talk about, you know, as you get closer, it gets harder, or gets more complex as you get closer, and the idea of, you know, refinement, and maybe, you know, someone like Miss Vander comes to mind, for example, and their various versions around the world. It would appear that you would reject that idea. And that there's a different school there, there's a different idea about what it means to, you know,
We
research
certainly
within
reject the idea of the
architecture.
one-liner. I mean, that's a...
What is a one-liner in
Well,
architecture? Is it possible to have a
Like
one-liner in a
E
building?
equals MC squared, that's a
No.
kind of a one-liner.
Maybe
It's on one line. Yeah.
maybe if you did say a building as a box, and then you just put a grill around it, would that be a one-liner?
Well, this is what I'm wondering, is it possible to have a one-liner in architecture?
Well, probably
I
not.
wouldn't have thought.
Do you do the
I mean,
one-liner over and over, is that?
It's a kind of a defensive reaction to the, what would you call it, internal contradictions between, like in a joke, you know, the contradictions and endless revelations of language that come out of a joke. It's somebody who's saying, oh, that's just a joke, and you think, well, that's not, thank you for the compliment.
It's probably one of the highest orders of understanding of the joke.
Yeah, to try and
To get a joke is, if you don't get it, you probably can't. It's very, very hard to explain. It'll take a lot of, because it's usually got, it's 49 reasons why it's funny.
So that
And
it's
none
a
of those reasons are
simplistic and
funny.
defensive rejection of complexity, actually, to say,
Yeah.
that's a one-liner.
Yeah. But it probably, the good thing about it is it might be saying that this project seems to be so vivid in some respect that I can't be bothered, or I can't see all the other generators of the project. I'm a bit overwhelmed by, you know, the apparent singularity of it.
There was some, you know, there's some nervous giggling when you discuss the issue of the copy. The proposition of the copy as an artistic and intellectual act is incredibly complicated about what constitutes a copy, what's the origin of it, it's just historical precedents, all of that sort of stuff. But people just say, oh, it's just a copy.
And a beautiful form of the copy is, of course, the translation. So that you've got something that's written in one language with jokes and cultural implications and all of that are implicit in a book written in one language. You transfer it to another language, which people think they are reading some German existentialist, don't they? But they're not. They're reading someone else who has rewritten the entire text in another language. And the nuances and complexities of that kind of translation are just fantastic.
So the guy who
And
translates
architecture kind of engages in that kind of fantastic operation, I think, so that we can look at whether it's Baroque from South America.
fantastic stuff.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, completely
And
malapropic.
bizarre, probably, or
Yeah.
malapropic compared to Bernini or something, you know, sort of exercising the initial goals of the Baroque.
The proper Baroque,
Yeah, the proper Baroque, exactly.
which is the improper.
And then to say
classical.
the only proper
Yeah, which is the more impure?
Yeah, that's right.
Which is was the worst pearl?
Which is the mongrel?
That one
And
really
the
bad.
environment
That one's even worse.
Bernini's kind of protege, who's probably way cleverer.
The mad
and
genius.
Was, yeah. What are you going to do? You're just going to say the Baroque can only be one, it can't be 10, it can't be 20 things. It can't have these strange versions, it can't be mongrelized, it can't be... So
and does that, some people would argue though that when we because we often refer to the Baroque, Rococo, 19th century, etc., that those guys, they're sort of academic classicism and art theory. It's an interesting thing to reject it, as you said before, as something that is readable as intellectual activity that then has a parallel life now, as opposed to just discarding it.
Yes.
And hence one of the
research,
great changes,
that's trawling it up again.
and one of the great changes in education is that history is gone. When we were trained, design was moribund, but history, we had 3 years architectural history, including art history and appreciation as another subject. All that's gone. All the sort
and philosophy of aesthetics. For those mad people in the philosophy.
Yeah. So all of that's just been swept out and possibly replaced by the cult of the original or the cult of the genius.
Unique.
Yeah, the cult of the unique. And this sort of, the endless nerby
And the
blobs
extraordinary thing is that those two things have come with deconstruction. How can you have the cult of the original and deconstruction as a sort of background to that? Because they're utterly opposed to one another.
Yeah.
So how does one create architecture without that knowledge, without that acquired knowledge of history and education?
Well, no, I don't think you can, but the results of it are stylisation, I suppose,
Your whimsy becomes...
or the operation.
Yeah.
The operational, the sort of genetic.
But you've got to know what to operate on.
Well,
I mean,
of course
the nice thing about it, though, that there's the kind of, this is something you want to maintain, is a kind of stab in the dark architecture as well, isn't there? Because it happens all the time. There's the stab in the dark as the only architecture worth doing, which is the one that just denies everything. We're just having to go now. You've got to say there's some quite nice things about that. And all architecture, probably, all interesting architecture has a bit of a stab in the dark. It's part of it, isn't it?
Yeah,
it has to be part of it. But you'd like to think that the other part of it, there is still a critical part of it, that can assess the stabs in the dark and find them into something. It
generates a sort of intellectual path that can tap into other and even contradict it or critique it or somehow challenges an intellectual line. The stab in the dark starts to reveal. That's when it gets interesting. If it's just this sort of, I don't know what I'm doing, it's aesthetically smoothed. I mean, I guess one of the things that very early on, halftime, etc., there was a strong axiom that underpinned it all, that even though you don't think you've got an agenda, you have an agenda. Embedded in the work are values and activities and beliefs that you won't even recognise. So it's time we all did recognise what they were and challenge them and investigate them. I think that axiom continues.
And I think that's what makes people who haven't been forced to go through that process really uncomfortable when they confront the work, because they start thinking about their own work and then they go, I don't even know what those things are in my work. Well,
I don't have an agenda.
Yeah.
I'm not commodified.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, so all these old terms, I suppose they're literary criticism terms, like interrogation, all of those that were so significant in the 80s, I suppose even into the 90s, as a mode of discourse have disappeared, haven't they? Now, if they've disappeared as chatter and they are finding their way into the work, of course, that's a beautiful thing. And you can see how that is and can be the case, even subconsciously, because architecture is becoming a lot more operational. It's becoming a lot more generating or even self-generating, and therefore the only way